Dr. Sarah Hill, we're so excited to have you back on. We're here to talk about the period brain, or essentially, why do women feel like crap leading up to their period? We're going to answer that question today. So you said in your new book, science has chosen to focus their research efforts only on women when we are in a cycle phase dominated by estrogen. This means that all the guidance we have been given about how to take care of our bodies and what our bodies need were not created with any guidance about what our bodies need or how they behave in a cycle phase dominated by progesterone. And the reason that so many of us feel terrible during this time is because we've been unwittingly fighting against our bodies when they are doing exactly what they are supposed to be doing. It's no wonder we all have PMS. Can you talk about this?
What a great excerpt.
I have goosebumps.
Yeah, I'm like, who wrote that? Like, that's really good.
It is.
That's so funny. No, it's no, it very much is true. Like, so I'm a research scientist. I've been studying women, and I've been studying hormonal influences on women's psychology and decision making and behavior since the 2000 is when I started graduate school. I graduated in 2006. It's been a long time, almost, like 25 years. And most of my field and most of the field of neuroendocrinology has really been focused on estrogen. And there's a lot about, estrogen this and estrogen this, and, the body does this and the brain does this, and look at what estrogen does. And so, there's a lot of sort of overt, research bias just favoring estrogen with no attention being paid to progesterone. But then also when you look at, experiments that are just done that include females or women as the subjects in research studies, generally they tend to try to isolate the impact of whatever the treatment is. So let's say that it's a drug or an exercise regimen. And they want to, have people try this exercise regimen or try this drug, and, they're randomly assigning it to this or the placebo. When they include women in that research, oftentimes they only include them in the early days of their cycle. So like days 1 through 9, or days 5 through 9 or 5 through 12, because they're trying to make sure that they're not capturing women when they're too hormonal, because then that would be a confounding variable in their study. And, they're trying to keep everything as consistent as possible. And this is just another way that, we have this estrogen bias in research, is that one, when researchers who are studying hormones like I do and other people in my field do, they tend to focus on estrogen because it's just sort of seen as the quintessential female sex hormone. And then you also get this bias just in research that includes women at all, because when researchers are trying to minimize the impact of hormonal variation on outcomes, they just isolate it to times when estrogen is the primary hormone. And the result is that most of the things that we've been told about how our bodies work and what it means to be normal and how our bodies respond to an exercise manipulation or diet manipulation or, a prescription drug, many of those things have been tested on women in the, under the control of estrogen. And when this is the primary hormone, without sort of paying attention to the fact that the way that our bodies do business differs across the cycle. And that when we are in the season of progesterone and when we're in the luteal phase, that because there's a lot of switch flipping that goes on in our bodies from head to toe, that this can potentially impact the way that our bodies respond to nutritional interventions or exercise interventions or drug-based interventions or therapeutic interventions. And there's a growing body of research that finds that everything ranging from the type of immunological responses that women have when they encounter an immunological stimulant, that changes based on the cycle. The way that women respond to psychotherapy can change across the cycle because there's some types of extinction therapy, in particular for women with PTSD, that tend to not respond very well to progesterone, because progesterone makes it more hard to condition fear extinction. And it changes our nutritional needs. So we need more calories, like up to, for some women, up to almost as many as 200 calories a day additional that we're burning during this phase. I mean, our sexual desire changes in important and interesting ways. Our emotional responses to things that seem threatening also changes during this time because our amygdala, the sort of fear center of our brain, becomes more interconnected with the rest of our brain during this phase of the cycle. And there's all kinds of cool things that happen to the female body as we shift from one phase of the cycle, one cycle phase to another. And when we try to ignore those things and the way that it's just so happened, with the way that science and the story of science unfolded, that this is one where this is a story about estrogen and progesterone has been sort of pushed aside as being this inconsequential thing that just doesn't matter. It means that we've, oftentimes what we're doing and the guidance that we've been given for what our, who we are and what we need doesn't always fit in the luteal phase. And and it is no surprise that many women feel awful and like their body is the enemy during this time because they're doing everything that they've been told that they're supposed to be doing to promote mental and physical health, and it doesn't seem to work. And it's because sometimes it doesn't, right? Because it's like what we need is actually different. And so we are working against our bodies a lot of the time in ways that, can make us feel like our body is the enemy. And so the period brain, a lot of it is about fixing this, right? And it's about addressing this, idea that one, that cycle phase doesn't, cycles don't matter and that hormones don't matter, because that's something that a lot of us are told. And, we're not really taught anything about, our hormones and our cycles until, we're much older. In my case, it was like I had to get a PhD, to learn about how my body worked, because I had no idea about any of that stuff until I was in graduate school. And then helping women understand, who are you and like what is your body actually trying to do in the luteal phase? What does it mean? What is there function here? Do we need to feel terrible? Like why do we feel terrible? And then addressing some of those things.
And I'm so curious. It's so funny. As someone like in the hormone space, I still have to remind myself every month, if I have those fear-based thoughts or I feel more stressed, my husband's like, where are you on your cycle? I'm like, you're right. So as much as I don't want to admit it, I do genuinely feel the shift. So if someone's listening, they're like, Sarah, I feel horrible in my luteal phase, right? Like no woman loves it. I mean, maybe some do if you really are educated on how it could benefit you, right? I think the lack of education is there. So to your point, how can we use that time to really foster our superpower? Because so many of us aren't even aware of how to do that.
The thing that we need to understand about the luteal phase and just understand about our cycles in general is that the things that our body is trying to do is in general pretty functional, right? And it's become dysfunctional, which we can kind of talk about. But, the first half of the cycle when estrogen is a primary hormone, I mean, this is when our body is rolling out the red carpet on everything related to sex and attraction. And it's because this is the phase in the cycle when, sex can lead to pregnancy. And especially when you get into the fertile window, which is generally, about 5 days prior to ovulation. So for a lot of women, it's like day 9 or so of the cycle, estrogen is very high. Women tend to feel a lot more energetic. They feel more attractive. They feel sexy. They're more interested in sex. They tend to have their attention more easily captured by men. And that's research with heterosexual women. I mean, it's just a time where women are sort of, feeling like sexy and all about sex. And it's a really kind of a glorious time. And neurobiologically, it's also like our brain becomes very sensitive to the differences between higher and lower quality partners. We become really attuned to testosterone cues. I mean, it's a cool time. And all of these things make sense, and when you look at the research that's been done on cycle-based shifts in women's psychology and behavior, it all is very consistent with this idea that our brain and body are working together to help, promote sex. Because this is a time, again, when sex can lead to conception. And so, of course, our brain is going to be finely tuned to those types of stimuli. But what we don't really pay any attention to, what, kind of gets left out of the conversation is like, well, what about the last 2 weeks in the cycle? Like, what is progesterone doing? Is it doing anything? Because I think that a lot of times people think it's not, right? Because it's kind of marginalized and it's marginalized in hormone therapy. Like women who are given hormones are oftentimes given estrogen, or they're given estrogen and progestin, which isn't the same thing as progesterone. And we can get into that later if we want to, but it is kind of seen as this like throwaway that's probably not even necessary, right? Like you probably don't need it, but progesterone is just as important as estrogen. And its job is to get the body, instead of being optimized for attraction and sex, it's about organizing the body and brain to be optimized for implantation and pregnancy. Right. And so it's going through the body from head to toe and flipping a bunch of switches that sort of shift the way that we experience the world and the brain and the body, to be optimized for those things. And that means, shifting, down regulating our immune system to be anti-inflammatory, which is a really beautiful effect that progesterone has. It does that so that way we wouldn't attack an implanting embryo, because if your immune system is like super ramped up, it'll go after anything that's non-self. And an embryo, by definition, is non-self. And so you experience some beautiful changes that way. It increases our attunement to potential signs of threat and danger. And this is because this is a time, when you're pregnant, and especially historically, you have to consider the fact that we've spent most of our evolutionary history living as hunter-gatherers, and women were very much dependent on their male partners for access to resources and for protection. And during pregnancy, this is the time when women were maximally dependent on their partner for these things. Because if you're a pregnant woman, it's obviously going to be more challenging for you to be able to defend yourself. And it's also going to be more challenging for you to acquire the types of calorically dense resources that are necessary during pregnancy and, lactation. Following pregnancy. And so this is a time when women are very heavily reliant on their partners, and they're also heavily reliant on their village, right? So their social connections with other people. And so any type of a threat to either their primary relationship or their close friendships are things that are potentially very costly. And because of this increased riskiness of like losing your village and losing your partner during this period of time, our brain actually lowers the threshold on what it considers a threat, right? So normally, let's say that you need 5 bits of stimuli that suggest there might be a threat before your alarm bells go off and you're like, there's a problem. Like there's a problem here. During the luteal phase, the brain actually lowers the excitation threshold in a way where we need less input that suggests a threat before the alarm bells go off, right? And what this means is that during this time, we're more likely to see little slights as being potentially signs of harbingers of disaster, right? Like, oh, my partner did not empty the dishwasher when he told me he was going to, and that must mean he doesn't love me enough. And our relationship is probably, in jeopardy, and we think these things and we know it's crazy. We know it's kind of crazy. Like, I say that out loud and it's like, but you also are kind of nodding along because we've all been there. We've all been in that space. And so we do become more sensitive. Our amygdala, as I noted, like one of the cool functional changes that researchers have found doing these functional brain scans is that our amygdala does become more interconnected with the rest of our brain during this time. And so it's more connected with any, sort of little bits of information that might be signs of threat and is really attuned to them. And this, of course, can help to prevent disaster, right? It allows us to be able to recognize when there's a problem early rather than when it's too late. And even though this is something that many of us don't enjoy, right, it is something that's functional. And honestly, knowing this has totally changed my life. And especially like when you are able to communicate this with a partner, and especially if you have a male partner like I do, and like many women do, it's, they have no idea what it's like to have a cycle. And just being able to, and as you were saying, Yasmin, where your partner was like saying like, what day are you on? That is a very common conversation in my household where it's like, what day are you on? And sometimes it can be annoying where it's like, it's not always about that. It's like sometimes you are just being a jerk. Right. But sometimes, many times it is about that. And I recognize it in myself, and it allows me to have the conversations that I need to have because, a lot of times those who are close to us have no idea the calculus that our brain is doing. And so they don't understand like how, okay, you didn't empty the dishwasher like you said you were going to. And so I am feeling that small slight is making me feel vulnerable in the relationship. Like it's making me feel unsafe. And even though this might not normally make me feel unsafe, I just need some reassurances. And if you're partnered with they'll give them to you, and then you get that and you're able to feel better. But being able to actually identify what's going on and why it's happening, right? This is probably something that my brain is flagging as unsafe, right? As like I'm vulnerable. And to be able to communicate, I'm feeling this way, and as silly as it might sound, here's what I need to know is true. If it is true, of course. right? I need to know that you value me and that our relationship is important to you and that, and that you value that and I am safe. And in hearing that is like music to the ears in the luteal phase, right? Because it is a more sensitive time. And sometimes it's our partner, sometimes it's our friends, right? And so there's this tendency for women, to be sensitive, but then also because another thing that happens during the luteal phase, just because it's a metabolically expensive phase, because your body is investing a lot of resources in all of the different things that have to happen to prepare for pregnancy, which is why our basal metabolic rate is part of the reason that it increases. And we become these like energy conservation machines, is we also tend to sort of socially withdraw a little bit during this time. And this is in part as a way to maintain energy, to be able to do, fuel all of the activities like the endometrial line proliferation and so on, and the remodeling of breast tissue and the other things that go on in the luteal phase that are metabolically expensive. I mean, the combination of socially withdrawing and then also being easily alarmed, I can oftentimes, lead to these cycles for women where they feel like, like they're afraid they're going to be abandoned and they're feeling anxious about that. And then, but they don't really feel like going out and connecting with people right now either. And I also think that recognizing those paradoxes and like knowing when the right time is that you just like need, to text your friends and get some reassurances, like, oh, I'm feeling kind of blah today. And, I'm feeling like nobody loves me. And, and your friends will say, we love you. Like, and that helps. I mean, it's understanding, I think sometimes understanding what it is that our body's actually trying to do. And trusting that there might be wisdom there. And sometimes, our body does dumb things that, that aren't, there is no wisdom to, right? Like desiring Oreo cookies, right? But that's because they're, of course, made to be hyper palatable. But I mean, many things, if we need, if we're extra hungry in the luteal phase, trusting that maybe there's a reason for this. If we feel like we need to stay home and just kind of hunker down in our PJs, understanding that there's a reason for this. And then also, being able to communicate about these things with the people I love, with the people that we love, I really think can be super helpful in terms of navigating some of the pitfalls that people tend to fall into in the luteal phase.
Yeah, I think the awareness is such a big piece, because just even knowing, hey, I'm feeling this way for a reason, it gives me assurance. There's two victims of my luteal phase, like drama, my husband and my brother who I work with. So like any little thing they say to me, I'm like, that's it. It's like, they hate me, whatever it is. But I think just knowing, okay, my period's coming in 2 days is helpful for me. I want to know, like, did my mom go through this? Did her mom go through this? Because I ask, and I think they forget a lot, even about pregnancy and all of that. But I want to know, is this kind of a modern day issue?
That's such an interesting question. And so the answer to this is yes and no, which is a really unsatisfying answer, but I've got a little bit more detail. And so like when we look around the world and we look at places that are sort of, like modern, societies, like Western modern societies, like Europe, like Western Europe and the US and Canada, and we see a lot of PMS over here. But then also in parts of the developing world, you also see pretty high rates of PMS. And in fact, there was a really cool study that I talk about in my book where it does a premenstrual mood map of women's moods over the course of a cycle. And it was done all around the world. And what you can see is that there was a consistent pattern, no matter how sort of, modern a society is, of worsening mood in the luteal phase. Which is really interesting. And so, we don't know for certain, like whether, for example, like our distant hunter-gatherer ancestors experienced PMS the way that we do currently. My guess is that, even though you get some of these changes in mood and you get changes in sexual desire and you get changes in your sort of outward facing energy. So our energy kind of shifts from being outward facing, which again is really energetically expensive to be like going out and chasing rewards, and becomes more internalized. Surely we've seen these things since since the dawn of time, and there's been research published on the experience of PMS since like the 1800s, and so I don't think that it's brand new. I do think that women can in contemporary environments suffer more than women in more traditional societies, and it's just simply because of all of the environmental changes that we've made that erode at our cellular resilience to hormonal changes. Because the fact is, the luteal phase in particular is a time of like huge hormonal change. And, we've all seen that little, drawing of the menstrual cycle where you see this like bump of estrogen, and then you see this comparably sized bump of progesterone in the second half of the cycle. What most people don't know is that those two Y axes are not to scale. They're different from one another. When you actually look at these figures, with these comparable size bumps, the progesterone bump is actually happening. It's 10 times higher than it peaks at a level that is 10 times higher than peak levels of estrogen. And so in the book, one of the things I do is I actually draw it out to scale for you all so you can see it. And when you actually draw it to scale where they're on the same size axes, you get this itty bitty little bump right prior to ovulation of estrogen. And then you get this big mountainous bump and fall of progesterone along with another little bitty bump of estrogen that you get in the luteal phase. And all of this is to simply illustrate the fact that the luteal phase is a time of tremendous hormonal change. I mean, you're having this, hormone that's changing and peaking at levels that are 10 times greater than anything you ever see in the follicular phase and near ovulation. And our body, whenever you have something that's changing that quickly, it really puts a lot of demand on all of the cells in our body to be able to quickly adapt. Right? Because if there's a lot of a hormone, and then one of the things about progesterone that actually makes it sort of magical is that when it gets broken down in the body, it releases this neurosteroid called allopregnanolone. And allopregnanolone activates GABA receptors in our brain, which are an inhibitory, it's like a form of inhibitory neurotransmission. And so it calms the brain down, right? So when you have high levels of allopregnanolone, which you do when you have high levels of progesterone, that sends a lot of calming signaling in the brain. And then when you have low levels of progesterone, or when progesterone is falling, all of a sudden you have less of that calming stimulation in the brain. And so what happens, and especially when we're talking about brain cells or talking about neurons, the rise and fall of progesterone, which coincides with the rise and fall of this calming neurosteroid allopregnanolone, leads our brain to be overwhelmed at first by this calming neurotransmission, right? Which can make you feel kind of tired and, like you don't really want to do anything. And, you're relaxed, but, kind of blah. And then all of a sudden it falls. And now you have all these naked receptors that are like, oh no, well, where's the chill out juice? I'm so wound up. I'm so wound up. And so to experience that smoothly requires the different cells in our body, the different cells in our brain, to be able to quickly adapt to oh my gosh, there's lots of, GABA transmission going on here. Oh my gosh, there's not very much GABA transmission going on here. And when our bodies are able to adapt to that quickly, the luteal phase feels a little different, right? It feels kind of like a dialed down version of who we are in the follicular phase, with some sort of key differences. But when we're not able to adapt to those things quickly, it can really feel like falling off a cliff, right? Because it can feel like, oh my gosh, like feeling totally overwhelmed by, sort of this chill out neurotransmission. And then all of a sudden having it go away, where you're almost going through like a state of like depression followed by anxiety. Because one is that your volume is too low and the other is that the volume is too high. But when our bodies are able to adjust and we're able to make those adjustments, like I said, you're still going to feel the difference. It's just not going to feel as stark.
I have a couple questions about that. So sorry. Can I ask a couple questions about that?
No, please. Yeah, I'm a professor, and so I blame my profession on the fact that I love it,
but I have like a million things going on in my mind. And I'm like, I want to make sure I understand for anybody who's listening. If somebody has like an anovulatory cycle, for example, so they potentially are not producing progesterone, are they going to feel the effects worse? I'm trying to understand like all of this that you're saying.
No, so it's really interesting. So, and so and this is another thing I talk about in the book that I think is something that most women don't know, and that is like when we study women and study women's cycles and look at different types of behavioral outcomes related to cycles. And this is just in a sample of healthy, regularly ovulating women with regular cycles, no endocrine disorders. We find a rate of failure to ovulate in about 30% of our samples every time that we measure it. And so many women have these cycles that are anovulatory. It's common. And during these cycles, it's really interesting because they've done research and looking at different, sort of like quote unquote PMS symptoms based on whether or not women ovulate or not. And what they find is that you actually get worse symptoms when you do ovulate compared to when you don't. And again, this goes to sort of illustrate the point that it's our body's ability to quickly adjust to these rapid changes in hormone levels that is necessary in the luteal phase. That seems to be the culprit behind, experiencing worse sort of, PMS symptoms.
So it's not the progesterone itself, it's just your body's ability to adapt to whatever changes are occurring.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and that's what's known as, if you want to like science nerd out, it's called the hormone sensitivity hypothesis. And it is the one that's best supported now in terms of trying to understand, in particular, things where you get pathological levels of PMS in the form of PMDD. But it seems that even for women who experience like a rockier luteal phase transition, who just have a difficult time sort of emotionally, but it isn't disrupting their lives in the same way that it's disrupted if you have PMDD, that oftentimes that it is this extreme sensitivity to the shifting hormone levels. And so anything that we can do to improve our resilience to those hormonal changes are things that are going to iron out the way that we feel in the luteal phase.
I would love to hear about that. How can we become less sensitive to those changes?
Right. Yeah. And, a lot of the things in our modern environment that we know aren't good for us tend to erode our resilience to hormonal changes. And so it's probably not going to surprise you to learn that it's kind of the usual suspects, right? It's things like lack of sunlight, not getting enough sleep, not eating healthy foods that actually nourish your body, inflammation, right? Not getting exercise. So it's all of the usual suspects because things that promote inflammatory activity in the body and especially chronic inflammatory activity in the body, those things tend to erode at neuroplasticity and just cellular plasticity in general. And those things, when you are lacking that plasticity and that ability to adapt to changes at the cellular level, this is what makes you feel bad, right? Because your cells aren't able to adapt. And, on the one hand, you could say, well, if you don't have an ovulatory cycle, you don't have to adapt to these changes, and so you should feel pretty good. And in general, we do tend to find that that's the case. Women who are having anovulatory cycles, they tend to have fewer PMS symptoms. And again, progesterone does these things. Some of the things that we experience as, quote unquote PMS are things that are happening on purpose. Like we talked about the fact that the fear centers of our brain do become more interconnected with other parts of our brain, right? We also tend to have more food cravings during this time because women are given one size fits all nutritional guidance, right? And they're told you need to eat X number of calories a day. And in the luteal phase, that increases by 7 to 11%. And so women are hungry, and so they're having food cravings because they're usually not eating enough, right? You also have the luteal phase shift in your energy levels where everything becomes more internalized because, again, your body's preparing for the possibility of pregnancy and it's trying to conserve resources. You get a downshift in sexual desire that is, again, consistent with the body preparing for the possibility of implantation. And in particular, during the implantation window, when progesterone is peaking, this is a time when inflammatory activity in the cervix and vaginal canal can be potentially disruptive. And so the body is essentially like just cutting it off at the pass temporarily by inhibiting libido in a way that's going to limit inflammatory activity down there, right? And so a lot of these things we think of as like symptoms of PMS, but they're really functional shifts that are experiencing in our bodies in response to progesterone. And again, if we have that plasticity and we are able to adapt to hormonal changes and rapidly changing hormonal states will experience those things as differences, but they don't need to feel awful, right? There's no reason to have food cravings if you're eating enough, right? And many women just aren't eating enough during this time because we as women have all been told that if we eat more than we're told we're supposed to, that it means that there's something wrong with us and that we have no willpower. And that, and again, I think that part of this has led to this narrative that so many women have that their body is the enemy because it doesn't, they're being told things to do that don't always fit.
And one thing that you've also mentioned, and we've kind of talked about it throughout the podcast is, you mentioned in the book, like PMS is part biology, part environment, and part neglect. And there's so much to talk about for all those three things. But if you could just fix one of those items, which one would it be that would have the most impact for a woman? If that's even an answer there.
Oh, yeah. Like I want to choose all three, but I would say that if you're going to pick one, I mean, I think that let's get rid of the neglect. Because like at the individual level, and you all are in this like really lovely space where you're helping to educate women about hormonal shifts and how important they are and how important it is to, promote the integrity of the body and all of these like wonderful things. But a lot of people aren't, they don't know anything about this. And it's so empowering to understand what your body is trying to do. As it's shifting across the cycle. And I think that recognizing those things and having a language to explain them to yourselves, and then also be able to explain them to other people in your life that you're interacting with that these changes might affect is incredibly powerful. And, so that's at an individual level. And I think that at a societal level, taking these things seriously, and not ignoring them and not pretending anymore that our hormonal changes don't matter, I think can also change the way that we do research and the way that medicine is practiced. So just to give you an example, some of the things that we know that happen across the, as we shift into the luteal phase, one of them is that gut motility slows, right? So your digestion actually slows. So your body's able to grab on to an additional amount of amino acids and nutrients. And this is something that, of course, if you're somebody who suffers from gut related issues like IBS, that means that your experiences of your disorder or of your condition are going to shift across the cycle. Medicine doesn't account for this, right? And so women just feel like they're crazy. And then also if they're being given treatment or treatment recommendations, they aren't being tailored based on the fact that you have two different gut motility, sort of averages, right? You have the way that your body acts in the follicular phase, you have the way that your body acts in the luteal phase, and they might need to be treated differently. Right. Similar to like asthma, we also see sort of shifts across the cycle because a lot of women experience luteal phase worsening of asthma symptoms. Women can experience differences in the effectiveness of treatments for things like ADHD as they go across the cycle, because that also is something that is influenced by our shifting hormonal states. And so I think that, if we decide, like if I had a magic wand and we're suddenly not neglecting the fact that these hormonal changes happen, I think that it can make just at the individual level and at the global level, I think can make some really serious positive changes for women.
I'm curious, like for any woman, for a lot of women who have been pregnant know what progesterone is, right? Because it's so important. How can progesterone act differently in the body during pregnancy versus in this luteal phase? Is it because we also have huge amounts of estrogen? What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, we tend to think about progesterone as just being this pregnancy hormone, right? And that it only matters at that time and that, the rest of the time it just is relatively unimportant. And the way that it acts in the body, I mean, it's the same and it's different, right? Because when you have these super high levels of progesterone that you have during pregnancy, and they are really high, it tends to, and they tend to be relatively stable. And again, we have to remember that one of the things that makes the luteal phase so tricky is that you're going on this roller coaster of up and down. And when you're pregnant, it goes up and then it stays pretty high. And so you're not having to go through this little roller coaster. And so the roller coaster makes things a little bit more tumultuous in the luteal phase compared to pregnancy. And the super high levels during pregnancy tend to also, it's almost like you're being hit over the head with that really calming type of neurotransmission that we talked about. I talked about how when progesterone is being broken down with the body in the body, it leads to the release of allopregnanolone. And allopregnanolone is like stimulates GABA receptors in your brain, and it's just very calming. And that's very much the experience that a lot of women have, especially as they move into the second trimester, where progesterone levels are very high and they feel very calm and like this feeling of well-being. And you get little micro doses of that in the luteal phase of the cycle. If you have this, resilience to hormonal changes that we're talking about, like a lot of women, especially in the early mid luteal phase, feel pretty good. They feel kind of tired and, not energetic and sexy like they did, but their well-being is pretty good, is pretty high. But then it's like you go through that crash. And again, especially if you don't have a lot of plasticity in your neurons and in the cells of your body, where they're not able to quickly adapt to hormonal changes, this can, not feel so great.
I was actually also reading, and I know this is separate from the period brain. We're kind of talking about the postpartum brain for a second, but I thought it was so fascinating that somebody had posted the other day that they thought that the new frontier of treating postpartum depression would be progesterone, essentially giving women progesterone to help. I'm assuming that you have this huge fall at that point, and maybe like supplying some of that progesterone could help with some of the more depressive symptoms. But I thought that was so interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. And so actually the way that the drug companies have dealt with this is because what makes progesterone such an amazing thing postpartum is that when it gets broken down, you release allopregnanolone. And allopregnanolone, again, it promotes calming neurotransmission in the brain. So it really chills the brain out. And this makes people feel a whole lot better than how they're feeling when they don't have, in the absence of this. And the way the drug companies have decided to deal with it is they've created a synthetic version of allopregnanolone that they sell, at like whatever the treatment is, like $30,000 for the treatment. When really all that it is it's mimicking the effects of the downstream byproduct of, this downstream metabolic byproduct of progesterone. And so actually administering progesterone would have the same effect. But I don't know that there's money to be made there. But for, this is an incredibly effective treatment, both for, and it's interesting because it's really, it's been found to be really effective in treating postpartum depression. And it also is really protective in the case of traumatic brain injuries of all things, because progesterone and allopregnanolone is byproduct. One of the things that it's really got going for it is that it has that calming neurotransmission. And in the case of a traumatic brain injury, like one of the things that'll really get you is you get it's neurodegeneration from excitotoxicity. So your brain is just like firing, right? Because it's just been injured and your brain is like, what's going on, right? Fire, fire, fire. And when you take allopregnanolone, it's like, and it calms the brain down. And so it prevents, these death of brain cells from excitotoxicity. In the case of postpartum, it's a very similar type of thing because you have your brain was being bathed with progesterone, right? So much progesterone. And all of a sudden it's this huge crash. And there's all these, these neurons like, hey, like, where's the calming juice? Like, what are we doing? This feels really anxiety provoking. And then when you give that to them, and then, you can kind of like taper off in a way that doesn't feel so terrible. It can be incredibly helpful to women. And I'm really excited. I'm hopeful that people start to realize that it's progesterone that's kind of the superhero there, because it is a lot cheaper, and that will make that sort of treatment better available to a wider range of women. Because currently these treatments are very expensive, and because of that, they're only available to a certain small population.
And you said starting this podcast, there's a difference between progestin and progesterone. So are you talking about the one that's more widely available is a progestin and people aren't taking the progesterone?
No, so the drug that they're giving women with postpartum depression is, and I think it's called brexanolone. I believe that's the drug name. I could be wrong on that though. And it's just a synthetic form of allopregnanolone. And so that's what its job is to mimic the effects of allopregnanolone on the brain. And that's kind of calming. And then it leads to improvement in symptoms, which is, like I said, it's great. But a progestin, and this is why this is important to sort of tease these things apart. A progestin is the synthetic form of progesterone that they use in birth control. And the thing about progestins, because we've been talking about all these beautiful things that allopregnanolone does, progestins, because they are not synthesized from progesterone, right? Most of them are synthesized from testosterone. And the chemists just take and manipulate the molecules in a way where it will stimulate progesterone receptors, but it's not actually progesterone, right? It's this Franken hormone that's been made out of testosterone. And because it's synthesized out of testosterone, when it gets broken down in the body, there's no allopregnanolone, right? So if you were taking progestin as a treatment for postpartum depression, you would just be made to feel worse, right? Because you're not getting any allopregnanolone. And progestins also aren't necessarily the best thing for mental health, because there's been a lot of research in the world of birth control, which of course, I know a couple of things about, and it tends to find that it increases your risk of developing mental health related side effects. And this is just another reason that, and I think this is another reason that progesterone gets a bad rap, is because a lot of times people are confusing it with progestin, which does make women feel pretty terrible. And even though when we are in the luteal phase and we're going through it, and progesterone is being released and we're feeling a little bit sensitive and, that sort of thing. If we have a lot of resilience to our hormonal changes, and again, these are just things that we can do by improving the physical health of our body. It doesn't feel that bad. It just feels different. And if you, learn to understand it and kind of honor what your body is telling you, be able to have conversations with people around you that you love, if you need to, just about what you're going through and how your experience as a human is changing during this time, it really doesn't need to feel bad. Whereas with something like a progestin, it increases the risk of anxiety and depression. And presumably this is in part because of the lack of allopregnanolone that these women experience. And there's been research showing that women on the pill have vastly lower levels of allopregnanolone relative to non-pill users. And the reason for this is they're not getting exposure to any progesterone.
Wow, that's so fascinating. And actually, speaking of birth control, because we have a whole episode on that you can listen to that we did with Sarah before. But I was thinking about it this morning. I was thinking about our last conversation and this conversation. And Yasmin, I might be throwing you under the bus for a second, but let's
go for it.
Yasmin and I frequently talk about how in our early 20s, I was very much like, I need to find a husband. I need to have kids. I'm on the hunt. Every guy was like, is he going to be my husband? Is this the right partner? I was not on birth control. Yasmin did not have that same experience, and she was on birth control. She was not like on the hunt for a husband. She was very career minded. She wasn't like having those same things as I was. Now, I was going through the cycle of, hey, I'm having my follicular phase, my luteal phase. I'm feeling all of the things. It's just a hypothesis to me, but is there any basis behind this?
I think it's so interesting. And so it is just a hypothesis. So understand, like, this is not based on empirical research, folks. But this is more common than Like, I hear about this all the time. And I had the same experience. So I was on, the pill for a really long time. And I didn't go through that, like, I'm on the hunt, whatever, after I went on the pill. Because before I was on the pill, I was like always, and then I started it and I was like, I don't know, 19 or something like that. And then it was like, I felt like, you know how like ant colonies have like the drones, right? Where they just like work. That was me. Like, I was just like, work, like, yeah. And then people would talk about things like PMS and I'm like, they're just making that up. I'm
Yeah.
like, that is a lie. I'm like, whatever, PMS, like, sure. Yeah. So no, I was like the worker ant, right? I was just like steady Eddie. I was, and not on the hunt. And then going off of it, because I thought that I'd outgrown, right, all of that, and that PMS was just this lie and, all this other stuff. And then I started cycling again and I was like so distracted by, sex and very much like have a healthier balance between like what's going on in my personal life and work. So I became less of a worker drone And then also I became very aware of the fact that there are changes to the mood that happen across the cycle. And so I'm like, okay, PMS is not a lie. I have not outgrown, being boy crazy. Like, it's just like this whole list of things that I experienced when I shifted off of it. And so I run a research lab, of course, and I've had, graduate students in my lab for the last 20 years, and many of them are women, and many of them during their time in grad school go through periods where they're on hormonal birth control or off of it. And all of them have told me this exact story where they're like, sorry, I realized that, my productivity, like I used to be like productivity Barbie, and now I'm not. And it's because I'm off the pill again, and I have one student, and she'll know who she is if she's listening, but I won't share. But she always, her story is that she always gets more androgynous when she's on the pill. And so she'd go on the pill and like cut her hair really short. And then, and she's like, yeah, no, I'm back on the pill. And so I don't want to wear, and she like, she would go through these phases where she had like longer hair and wear skirts. And, just like really kind of in touch with her feminine energy. And then she'd go on the pill for a while. Because, if she was in a new relationship or whatever, and then she cut her hair short and she's like, yeah, I'm in my androgynous phase again because I'm on the pill. And so it is really interesting. And especially like, I think it's even more interesting, like when you have some awareness of it and you start to kind of put the pieces together. But I have very much seen that spectrum. And even, like I said, with these sort of like within subjects designs with my graduate students as they're going on and off of it, noting their own experiences and shifting priorities. And or with the other student, just sort of like shifting investment and like sort of attachment to like sort of her feminine energy, or like turning it off and being very, sort of focused more on the career things, and also, with her haircut. So interesting.
Oh my gosh. I might need to just have an experiment of going on birth control to have this feeling. Like, what does that feel like to not feel like, oh, these waves of different things? But no, I'm not going to.
Well, yeah. So I have a student right now who is, she's really cool. So she just came in and she's like, I want to be a one woman experiment. So we're going to measure her. She's naturally cycling, but she's going to go on the pill, and we're going to measure a bunch of things. And then also after she goes off of it.
So fascinating.
There's actually like, there's a scientific method behind this. They call it deep sampling. And it's where you take a lot of measures of one person, over time, because if you control for a lot of different variables, I mean, there's so much individual variability when you do sort of, between subjects designs where you're measuring lots of different people, and, and then there's all the statistical tools that allow you to wash out variance. But you can actually really learn a lot when you study like one or two people really deeply, and see how things change over time. And if you all haven't talked to or seen the work of Dr. Emily Jacobs at UC Santa Barbara, she does this really great work where they do brain scans. They've done brain scans of women every day for 28 days across the cycle. And then they do the same thing with women on the birth control pill. And you can see the morphological changes that happen in the brain. And it's really fascinating work. And she uses this deep sampling approach. It's really fascinating.
There has been a little bit of a swing. I think cycle syncing became popular, and then there has been a little bit of pushback I've noticed recently, where people are saying, cycle syncing is just not worth it, and you don't need to change what you're doing, and every woman should kind of essentially feel pretty much the same. If you feel a little bit off, then maybe switch things. But it's so wild to me that somebody could claim that these hormones are not having such a huge impact on our body. Like, the proof is there, and there's such a big part of how we feel every day. And, our heart is affected by estrogen. Our brain is affected by estrogen and progesterone. Like, it's kind of crazy to me. It makes me scratch my brain.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way. And I think that some of that is, I do think that some of the, sort of so-called cycle syncing stuff can be a little bit impractical and not necessarily based in science, right? Like this idea that you should have your boss schedule meetings around your cycle. And you know what I mean? It's like, that's just not realistic for people. And so I do think that there's some of, pushback where it's like, is it really necessary to turn you and your whole family's life upside down because of your individual menstrual cycle? And it's like, I don't think that that's the answer. But I also don't think that the answer is, oh no, well, it doesn't matter anyway, because there's just too much research to show that it does. And the way I look at it, and I talk about this in my book, if what you're doing, if treating your body the same way every day is working for you, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's how we say it in Texas. And I believe that there's some value to that. But if you're feeling like there might be something better, right? And like for me, I found, for example, like I really struggle doing resistance training during the luteal phase. I hate it. I hated it. It just made me like, because I would feel weaker, and then that would frustrate me. And so then it made my gym time totally unenjoyable. And so I finally was like, all right, screw it. Like I'm going to try to focus most of my heavy lifting in the first 2 weeks of the cycle. And then I'm going to try to focus more on doing, just like taking long walks and doing restorative work and doing some hot yoga and things like that during the second half of the cycle. And the agreement I made with myself is that I had 3 months, and that I had to do it for 3 months, because that's sort of the amount of time it takes to be able to see any change in your body. And so I gave myself 3 months to do things that way. And then the deal was, if my clothes started to not fit, or if I was getting weaker, that I'd go back to doing things the way I was. And to my great surprise, I got stronger. And it was hugely surprising to me, because I was actually doing fewer, but not by much. I was doing fewer resistance trainings, but I was loading up on them during the first 2 weeks. I enjoyed my gym time more, because I didn't feel like I was forcing myself to do something that I didn't want to do. And it made me, I think the mechanism behind me getting stronger. One, we know that estrogen sort of releases a bunch of different types of cofactors and factors in the body that are promoting muscle growth. So estrogen is good for muscle growth, and progesterone doesn't have these same wonderful properties. But for me, I think the mechanism behind me getting stronger was that having that period of, listening to my body and going and doing something else, but continuing to stay active, gave me more motivation to push it harder when I came back, because I no longer felt like, this again, and so maybe the secret is just taking 2 weeks off, and it doesn't matter what 2 weeks it is. But there's a lot of research that suggests that estrogen does support muscle building, and testosterone also tends to rise and fall with estrogen in the cycle. So you have more testosterone in the early phases of the cycle too. And so those things together, coupled with the fact that I think that just even having that little break was really helpful to me in getting me stronger. And so I've been doing things that way ever since. And it feels really good to me. But everybody is different. And that's also sort of another message in the book, is that, there's a lot of value to learn your personal relationship with your hormonal changes, because, even though, one of the things we talked about today is most women feel really good when estrogen is high and rising. Like that's generally the time that women feel the best. But there is about 8% of the population that feels terrible near ovulation. And yeah, like their mental health plummets and all. And there's been a couple of studies now where they've tracked just big populations and their mood shifts across the cycle. And there is this little pocket of women who have this experience. And these are real, these aren't made up. This is really this woman's experience. And so you need to know that about yourself, because if that describes you, that's really valuable information to have, because then maybe some of these conversations with your partners and others that, may be able to be supportive to you when you're having periods of low mood can be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been talking to a lot of different experts about the impact of histamines and estrogen, and why maybe sometimes when women have this spike in estrogen where other women feel good, some women feel awful. They start to get all these, migraines or other histamine-like symptoms. It's very fascinating, but I'm just so excited that this book exists. I wish I had this book when I started to feel all the things that I felt when I got my period. What's your kind of like biggest hope with the release of this book?
My biggest hope is that we really start taking women's hormonal changes seriously. I mean, and in the book, I close with this section where I talk about how it's time that we really change the way that we understand biological sex. So just understanding that sex matters, right? And this doesn't mean that gender doesn't matter, because it absolutely does, right? And it's not always the same as sex, but just that we need to, as scientists and people then who are clinicians and, do medicine, understand that women's bodies are different oftentimes than men's bodies, with things that have absolutely nothing to do with penises, vaginas, and breasts, right? Because as you mentioned, things like cardiovascular function and immune function and lung function, a lot of these things are touched by our hormones. And because of this, it means that we aren't just smaller, less hairy men, right? We're different. And so understanding that matters, and that our cycle phase matters. So our hormones matter. And I want to see science change in a way that takes that seriously, right? So I want to see research that starts as a default assumption that men and women might be different, and that you have to prove otherwise before you just lump men and women together in research, because that's what often happens. And they don't even test for sex differences, which is crazy to me. And especially with things like, where we know there are sex differences. So like if you look at psychiatry journals, 80 to 90% of the studies don't test for sex differences, even though we know that women get twice as much depression, twice as much anxiety as men. And so that's one is like really like appreciate, like having to show like and test separately in men and women, and then studying women as women. So that is looking at how our bodies respond to things in the season of each estrogen and progesterone. And then ultimately, being able to then expand that to understand the difference between women during states of pregnancy and menopause, right? But starting small, but really trying to change and start to understand that women's health is about the health of women. And that means actually understanding women as women. And I think that once science starts to do this, I think that it'll fundamentally change medicine for the better.
Gosh, what a gift, Sarah.
Yes, seriously.
I love having you on. I always think about how lucky your students are to have a professor like you just to listen. I'm like, I could sit there in a lecture for 4 hours, and I don't love lectures, but you make it so tangible, attainable, and we know you're making such big swings in this world. So thank you for all your work, and so fun seeing you again today. And we'll share all the information about your book in the show notes as well.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me. It's so great to see you both.